Welcome to Learn Extra Matric Revision. Today we're going to be covering history question 1 of paper 1, looking at the Cold War and the influence that had in forming specific spheres of influence in the world during the 1960s and onwards. You'll notice that today is the first time that we are broadcasting the history program, hence the need for me to wear a suit and tie to dedicate this specific occasion. So please excuse my formalness, and as we move on, hopefully you can spend some time relaxing with me and getting through question 1 of the history paper. So if we can go and move on to the session. If you see down on the board, I have here the impact of the Cold War, and there are a few things on a checklist that are important for us to know. Firstly, the whole theme surrounds the idea of this creation of spheres of influence. Now, the influence comes from an ideological background of that versus capitalism versus communism. And the whole theme that we look at as we go in through this question 1 basically surrounds those two ideologies. So everything that we look at will go back to that specific theme. Underneath that, we have this whole breakup of the economic, the political, and the social conditions that happened because of this split in the world at the time. And the first one that we need to know and we need to look at is this whole idea of the two armed wings of the specific groups. The first one being NATO. If you see on the board here, NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and was basically the USA's, the United States of America, should I say. It was their armed grouping that was there to protect the ideas and ideals of capitalism against those of communism. Secondly, we have the Warsaw Pact, which was the USSR's response to NATO. That took into account a lot of the countries that were placed in the European satellite states, we call them, in Eastern Europe, who came under the influence of Russia, and together, obviously, we had the USSR. Then we have the Marshall Plan, which is another key point that we need to understand, not so much in what will be asked in this year's paper, but more of an understanding when it comes to writing and extended writing, that we have an idea of where these ideas come from. So the Marshall Plan is one that we look at. You'll know that General Marshall was involved in Europe on the United States side at the end of World War II. It was the economic recovery plan that was instituted by the Americans for the Europeans to help them overcome the savages and the economic downfall after World War II. The Marshall Plan was obviously also given as a way to prevent communism, from coming into those countries that were devastated by the war. Comecon was a similar initiative implemented by the USSR, basically, which was an economic policy that involved itself and its allies, which we've already mentioned, with the satellite states that existed in Eastern Europe, that tied them together in a long-term sort of plan. The third one, and probably one of the more important key points that we need to understand as we move through this Cold War puzzle, is that of containment versus expansion. Now, the containment comes in the idea that after World War II, with the advancement of communism and it really becoming sort of an ideal that could replace capitalism for many countries and the conditions that they were in, the Americans, under President Truman at the time, decided to put this idea of containing containing communism, as opposed to allowing it to expand. Where obviously the USSR at the same time was trying to expand its influence around the world, so that would have meant introducing communism into more countries and obviously expanding their sphere of influence. The United States tried to garner that by their policy of containment, and that is covered under the Truman Doctrine, which provided not only financial but also military and economic support to countries that signed in with the idea of staying a capitalist country and formed part of the countries that would eventually form up the membership of NATO. Now, the whole thing that tied this together, if we can carry on here, this balance of power is an extremely important concept. And the reason that it's an important concept is that we know the Cold War never became a heated war, if we can use that term, between the United States and the USSR, between communism and capitalism. There was no physical battle that ever took place between those two superpowers. And the reason for that was this whole idea of mutually assured destruction. We know it as MAD. It will often come up in a question paper. It will have the acronym. MAD stands for mutually assured destruction, which basically, because of the size of the military arsenals of both the United States and of the USSR, they basically balanced each other out. If there was one country that was dominant, there would have been, or one superpower which was dominant, it would have overpowered the other one, and there would have been a conflict that took place. But because they were on level footing with each other, that never ever turned into a heated war. So it remained a Cold War, hence the term that was used all the way up until the end of the 1980s. But please remember this idea of mutually assured destruction. It's governed a lot of policies of both the USSR premiers and the presidents of the United States. As I mentioned before, these two superpowers, although they never came into contact with each other, they were involved with regional conflicts on in all over the world, from Asia to Africa to the Pacific, and further on into South America. The first one that we've looked at, and you would have covered this when going through the curriculum in your own schools, would be the initial one in Korea, which happened in the late 1940s, early 50s. Then we went into Vietnam. And then finally, the USSR invasion in Afghanistan. Now, because those were regional conflicts that happened, the superpowers were not necessarily fighting each other, but they were supporting different groups within those regional conflicts. So, for example, in Vietnam, where we had the Viet Cong, which was a communist group, they were supported by the USSR. They were provided with training. They were provided with military weapons. America went in there to stop the Viet Cong from taking control in Vietnam because of their containment policy. They felt that Vietnam was the only or last vestige of capitalist control in Southeast Asia, and they wanted to hang on to their position. The USSR sponsored the Viet Cong to try to expel the Americans. Eventually, we know that was a long, drawn-out affair. But again, ultimately what it came down to was this whole idea of mutually assured destruction, which meant that the two superpowers never took that to a live conflict between themselves. For the past year and for the future years, as far as we can tell at the moment, the specific section that we're going to be looking at when looking at these regional conflicts as a case study for question 1 will revolve around Cuba. Now, Cuba is probably one of the more important ones, not in terms of length, but in terms of when two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, came the closest to actually coming to a physical war situation. We will go through each of these points, and you'll notice when later on seeing some of the questions from the last year's paper, we'll be looking at some of the extracts where that whole idea will come through, how this actually almost turned into a hot war. And to understand Cuba, we need to understand its history. And that goes back to the Civil War, where Castro seizes power. Castro was a socialist. He came and took control over Cuba when General Batista, he was in charge of Cuba leading up 1940s, early 1950s. He was a pro-capitalist. He was supported by the Americans, and he had close economic ties with America. Castro was a people's leader, people's liberator. He had large support from the peasants and the farmers that lived in Cuba at the time, and this was a socialist takeover that took place in Cuba. After the initial takeover by Castro, a lot of the capitalist elite in Cuba decided to flee towards the United States, and that would eventually lead to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which is again an important theme when looking at this whole idea of Cuba as a case study on the Cold War. Now, to sum it up in as brief a way as possible, the exiles that left Cuba that were capitalists, they were supported in America by the Central Intelligence Agency, which we know as the CIA. The CIA trained them in the need to send them back to Cuba to cause another social revolution where the capitalists would then again take control. This plan by the CIA had the full backing of President Kennedy at the time. Eventually, it was repelled as Castro had got forewarning of the battle to take place, and ultimately it turned out to be an embarrassment for the United States, and particularly Kennedy, who had supported this takeover that didn't materialize. From that, we look at the relationship that existed between Castro and Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was the premier of the USSR at the same time that Castro was in power. Khrushchev was wanting to form closer ties with Cuba. It gave them an in into South America with regards to trade and the economic sort of benefits that would come from that. But not only that, there was a sort of deeper meaning for wanting to get involved with Cuba. Those of you that have seen a map of North America where the United States is, you'll know just below to the south of North America, we have the small island of Cuba. Now, at this point, there was no long-range missiles that were based in the USSR or any of its allies that could reach the United States. However, the United States, because of their alliances, particularly in Western and Central Europe, and specifically in Turkey, they had bases where they could launch military attacks against the USSR. Now, if we go back to our idea of keeping a balance and the idea of mutually assured destruction, this was a balance that was in favor of the United States to the detriment of the USSR. So it was very important for the USSR to readjust that balance, and the only way they could readjust that balance was to have a Soviet base that was close enough to the United States that if they were threatened, they could threaten the United States back because they had opportunities to launch ballistic missiles. They could, in fact, be carrying nuclear warheads and attack the United States. So those are one of the big themes that come out of this section. Then we take a close look at Kennedy. You need to know Kennedy, both his reaction to the initial disaster of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and then also the building of missile silos by the USSR in Cuba itself. Kennedy plays a large role in this. He becomes very aggressive towards the Russians, who are the main players, obviously, in the USSR, and he takes a leading role in trying to firstly repel what Khrushchev is doing in Cuba, and then ultimately setting up a blockade that would take us to the brink of possibly what could have been a nuclear war. So that refers to the missile crisis. I've made mention already how the USSR saw Cuba as the ideal strategic position to launch missiles against the United States. So they started building these missile silos. Kennedy was able to take photographs from spy planes that were monitoring the situation. Kennedy had realized that there was USSR influence in Cuba, and he wanted to know what was happening. So the spy planes were going over, and they were taking photographs of these specific installations that were happening. As a result of those installations, we look at the American reaction, and eventually a naval blockade is established around Cuba to stop the USSR ships carrying equipment, material needed to build these silos, and in fact the warheads and the ballistic missiles that they would have used to house at those silos. They put up this blockade to stop those USSR naval ships from coming through. Now that conflict, you can imagine the whole USSR naval force carrying all these weapons, coming into contact with this American blockade, which have got their own military ships that are in position. And it took a last-minute diplomatic effort to prevent those two countries from, in fact, firing on each other, which could have offset a nuclear war at the time and would have been referred to as a Third World War after the world had already been through World War I and II. So that took care of the naval blockade. And then finally, to understand this section properly, you need to understand the outcomes. What was ultimately achieved by this? It was found that Cuba became almost an insignificant role player again when the USSR left. What was the relationships like between the two superpowers afterwards? What were the steps put in place to avert a future nuclear war that could happen? All these things are things that you need to know when coming to answer this question. Although it doesn't come up often in the source-based questions, you will need to know it when answering the extended writing. It's often a topic there, obviously a topic that we're going to be looking at a little bit later. And talking about source-based questions, I think the best way to deal with the type of questions that are going to come up and the type of things that you need to be thinking about when answering the source-based questions is to physically tackle a few that have appeared in past papers. You need to remember that in the paper setup as it stands at the moment, each question is out of 75 marks. 45 marks of those come from the source-based question. So source-based questions are very important. The other 30 marks will come from the extended writing, which we will look at a little bit later. So to get right into it, and I tell my learners this as well, please, if there's a tip I can give you, is read the sources first before answering or even looking at the questions. You'll have a good idea of what type of questions will be asked once you've read through the sources. But what I found in the past, if you look at the questions first, and then you read through the sources, you tend to try skim through and look for specific answers or key points that relate to the questions, and you sort of miss the understanding or the relevance that comes through from the sources. So we're going to take a little bit of time in going through these sources, highlighting what is important, and then we'll have a look at the question related to that source. There are 3 sources that we'll be going through now. So without further ado, the first source we're going to be looking at, as it appears on the screen in front of you as source 1, it says at the top there, the source below consists of 2 extracts which focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now it's important to note, as soon as we see 2 extracts, so these are 2 extracts from people having a conversation or words that they have used, immediately in my head I'm starting to think they're either going to ask us to compare, or in some way use both sources. Is the one giving a different source to the first one? So those are the things that I'm immediately starting to think, and you need to start thinking like that as well. When looking at a source, again, before we even get started, and I've just read where the source is from, before we even get started, there are a few things that we need to do to give the source some sort of context. And when I talk about context, we need to understand where in time does this source fit in. We know it's got to do with the Cold War. Who is talking? Whose extract is it from? Is there a date that is given that assists us in putting it in context? There's a difference between talking about the United States in 1945 as opposed to the United States in the late 1970s. So we need to put these ideas into context. So the information that we can grab straight away, which is the relatively easy stuff, is firstly, as you go through extract 1 here, it says Andrei Gromyko's view. Okay, Gromykos, okay, we know is the Soviet Union's foreign secretary. Yeah, he was the foreign secretary during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Without reading anything further, there are a few things that we can take from that specific point. Firstly, we need to ask ourselves the question, what view is Gromyko coming across when he is making this extract? As the foreign secretary, who does he report to? These are the questions we need to be asking. It helps us to understand not only the context of the source, but also later the relevance And then also, as a key word that comes up in history all the time, is that idea of bias. Is this a one-sided view? Is he giving two opinions when he's talking? These are the things that we need to think about. So as we move down in this first extract, I'm just going to read through quickly with you and then just highlight some of the important points. It says that the United States over several years had established offensive military bases around socialist countries and primarily near the USSR borders. So first key point here that we need to make note of is offensive. Now when we're talking about offensive, that is an attacking position. If we were talking the opposite, we were talking about a defensive position. So immediately offensive is explaining, in his view, the military bases that the United States have put up around perceived or known socialist countries. So immediately we start seeing this as this is an aggressive talk towards the United States. So it might help us a little bit later on when discussing the idea of bias. The placement of medium-range effective Soviet missiles in Cuba was undertaken only after the United States ruling circles continually rejected proposals to remove American military bases. So the second point there is blaming America for the USSR's position. They're saying the only reason why Cuba became a possibility to installing a missile silo was the fact that America had already done this to the USSR. So again, no blame is being taken by the USSR. So again, we have a case for discussing biasness, and already we can start thinking that's probably one of the questions that will be coming up. And the final giveaway in our perspective, when looking at context, where does the source come from? It says through Russian eyes. Okay, President Kennedy's 1,036 days by Gromko. So this is through the eyes of the Russians, the USSR. This is how they perceived the Cuban Missile Crisis. So keep that in mind just now when we're going through the questions. We did know that there were two extracts that were mentioned. The second one, okay, in 1984, Fidel Castro, there we got a date. Yeah, and then we got a person, just to help us with context, was interviewed by American journalist Tad Suzlik. The journalist asked Castro why he was willing to allow Soviet missiles to be placed into Cuba or placed in Cuba. So that's to give us in context. 1984, that's some 20 years after the crisis happened. It's an American journalist interviewing Fidel Castro, who was leader of Cuba. Coming across, eventually we can immediately start thinking, how's this journalist going to be writing this? And we'll see as we go through now, if he gives us any ideas or any clear indications that maybe this could be a little bit biased towards the American side. So firstly it says that it was necessary to make it clear to the United States that an invasion of Cuba would imply a war with the Soviet Union. It was then that they proposed the missiles. We preferred the risks, whatever they were, of a great tension, a great crisis, to the risk of the inability of having to await a United States invasion of Cuba. So Cuba, again, was saying that they were willing to accept the USSR advances, by the USSR coming on board and providing the so-called muscle behind the Cubans. They alleviated the threat of invasion by the United States. If you recall, we go back to the whole idea of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Cuba became very, how can we put it, they were very uneasy about the situation that America had already invaded them once before. Could the situation happen again? They felt that the situation was less likely to happen if the USSR had been involved in putting missile silos in Cuba, and that if there was an attack on Cuba, in fact it was an attack on the USSR. And going back to the whole idea of the mutually assured destruction, that would mean that in Fidel Castro's eyes, when he gave this interview, that there would be a balance remained and the United States would not attack. So the two extracts that we've looked at, if we go across to the questions. So question one, so this is referring to the two extracts. It says here, according to extract one, where did the USA establish military bases? As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of your of your screen, you'll see there's a 2 times 1 and a 2 in brackets. Now the initial 2 is for the number of facts that are being required. So you need to put 2 points down. For every point that you put down, or fact that you put down, you will get 1 mark. And then obviously that refers to the 2 marks. Question 1.1 is what we would refer to as a level 1 type of question. This is your simple questions. These are usually happen at the beginning of each of the sources, just to get you into having read, to make sure that you've understood what you've read, and to extract basic information from the source. So, for example, it says, according to extract 1, where did the USA establish military bases? If we go back to what it mentioned at the top here, it talks about that they're primarily near. Again, let me get my pen out. Primarily near the USSR borders and the socialist countries, around the socialist countries. So those are your 2 marks. You get 1 for socialist countries and 1 for near the USSR borders. If we go back to question 1 and we move down to 1.2, why did the Soviet Union decide to place missiles in Cuba? Here we see it's for 1 mark again, or 1 fact, sorry, for 2 marks each. We would also consider this a level 1 question. Go straight back to the extract and withdraw the information. So it's asking us specifically here, why is the important question. Did the Soviet Union decide to place missiles in Cuba? So if we go back, we're still dealing with extract 1. And it refers to this whole section over here. It says the placement of medium-range effective, and sorry if you're following me here. It says the placement of medium-range effective Soviet missiles in Cuba was undertaken only after the United States ruling circles continually rejected proposals to remove American military bases. So basically, the information that we need to extract of why the USSR was wanting to build a missile silo over there was to do with the United States' unwillingness to move their missile bases that were in range of Cuba. So that will give you the mark. And for putting that 1 fact down, you'll in fact get 2 marks for that. Here's a question that we knew was coming up because of the information and the context that we took the source from. If we look at question 1.3, it says, as a historian, referring to us as answering this paper, explain to what extent the information extract 1 may be regarded as biased. Now obviously to understand this question and to be able to answer this question, we need to understand what that word means. Now, if I was in a class environment where I had the learners in front of me, I'd be getting 3, 4, 5, 6 different accounts of what bias is. But if we're just going to sum it up for ourselves here and for the purposes of what we're needing to do, we would say bias is a one-sided point of view, not taking into account the other side of the story. For our moment and what we're trying to achieve here, you just need to know that bias is a one-sided view favoring a specific group, not relative, well, not necessarily told on truth, and ultimately leaving out sections that wouldn't back up of what the statement was. So when we look back to extract 1, there are a few things. Let's just get rid of some of the other writing that we've written all over the. Yeah, we need to come up with 3 points. Let's just make sure. Sorry, only 1 point is required. It says here 1 fact. And for that 1 fact, we are going to get 3 marks. So if we go back, we need to find 1 reason to say that we consider this bias. And there are a couple that we can point to. Firstly, we can talk about, if we go back to the top here, we can talk about the author of the extract. The Russian Foreign Secretary. We know that the Soviet Union, they controlled their men that worked for them. So we would understand that he's not going to say anything that's anti-USSR. chances are he does that, he's going to be recalled to the USSR to have to explain himself. So we immediately, just from that point, looking at the author of the extract. The second thing we can look at and that we can mention is that no blame was taken by the USSR for the Cuban Missile Crisis to associate it into one point. No blame was taken by them. They blamed everything on the United States. So again, I'm just seeing myself from maybe what was reality, and I'm only just focusing on the parts that suit me. So I'm only having a one-sided point of view, which illustrates bias. As a third point, if you needed one, the title of the book, Through Russian Eyes, again, as with the first example, it gives us this idea of one point of view, through the Russian eyes, not looking at it through the American eyes with a little bit of the Russian eyes, just through the Russian eyes. So any one of those would have given you the 3 marks as they appear over there. Then 1.4. Comment on whether Castro was justified in allowing the USSR to place missiles in Cuba. This comes from extract 2. They're asking us to look at extract 2. Again, they're asking for 2 facts that will give you 2 marks per fact, which means 4 marks for this question. Now, the key point that we need to look at when answering this question is, what is it actually asking us to do? And in this case, it's asking us, is Castro justified in allowing the USSR to place missiles in Cuba? Justified, we understand to mean, is there a good enough reason why something has been allowed to happen, or are the reasons that are given not good enough in terms of what we're discussing now? So if we go back to extract 2, we're either looking for evidence that suggests, from Castro's point of view, that allowing the USSR into Cuba was justified. So if that's the argument that we're going to go with, we need to find. And we can find 2 points here. Firstly, at the top, it says here, to the United States that an invasion of Cuba would imply a war with the Soviet Union. It was then that they proposed the missiles. We preferred the risks, whatever they were, of a great tension, a great crisis, to risk of the impotence, inability of having to await the United States invasion of Cuba. So the 2 main points here that we can mention is the first one there is that Cuba, if I can just highlight underneath there for you, would imply a war with the Soviet Union. I've got my big brother with me. If you're gonna pick on me, then you're gonna have to fight my big brother. In this case, I'm representing Cuba, and my big brother is the USSR. So that was one of the reasons that Castro used to justify the situation. The second one was that they would rather do that than, as we see here, they preferred the risks, whatever they were, of a great tension, of a great crisis, to the risk of the impotence or inability of having to await the United States invasion of Cuba. So instead of hanging around on the chance that it might happen, it might not happen, this was something that was concrete. They knew if they had this in place that the United States would not risk an attack of Cuba. So those are 2 points that justify in the mind of Castro why he allowed the USSR into Cuba at this time. If we were to argue that there was no justification, we would have to look at, after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, that there was an international embarrassment that was caused by that fiasco, particularly on Kennedy, who as the President of the United States, in all chances would not risk a similar international scene to take place, so that the threat of actually attacking the United States, attacking Cuba, had diminished significantly by this time. Those are the points that you would need to argue if you were saying that this was not justified. Easiest and most straightforward answer in this particular case is to say it's justified because we can use the information provided from the source. That's been a lot to take in for the first half of an hour. I think now's a good time to take a break. When we come back, we'll be having a look at question 2, and then moving on to both the paragraph question and then a quick look at the extended writing. See you after the break. Welcome back. We are halfway through our session today, and we're going to be moving swiftly on to question 2 before we start tackling some of the bigger stuff in the paragraph question and the extended writing. The next source that we're going to be looking at you'll see at the top here, it says source 2. Again, we want to be reading the source before we even start looking at the questions. So let's go through and let's remember to put our information into context. So let's highlight those words and those information that we need that help us give relevance to the source. So firstly, it says at the top there, this was the main headline of the New York Times. Okay, straight away, New York Times. I'm sure most of you know New York is in the United States, so we know this is a United States paper. So already, again, we're starting to think, maybe is this going to be a one-sided point of view, and then we can start looking at things like bias, and possibly that a question would come up to justify that. The date is given as the 23rd of October, 1962, just prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis becoming a major event. It highlights the USA's blockade of the Soviet missiles to Cuba. So this was prior to the intervention between Khrushchev and Kennedy, but it's after the blockade had already been set up. So already that gives us relevance to when this newspaper headline. I did mention that we could possibly be looking at bias, a one-sided point of view. You'll also know another word that comes up all the time is that of propaganda. Now, propaganda in the simplest form is the influencing of the way we think. And that could be done through advertising, through things such as newspaper headlines. It's not changing the way we think, but it's influencing the way we see things and in any sense of what emotions or what feelings that we'll have. A more severe form, just to take it off note a little bit, of propaganda is that of indoctrination, which actually changes the way that we feel about things. And this obviously happens over a longer period of time. But for this case, we could possibly be looking at propaganda and influencing our mind, specifically considering that this is a newspaper headline. So if we go on to the paper, again, we see that it's the New York Times. All the other information we have already got from the small blurb at the top. It says there, the US imposes arms blockade on Cuba on finding offensive missile sites, Kennedy ready for Soviet showdown. Now, if I was reading that and I was an American, that would probably give me, just thinking about it in general, I'd feel a sense of pride. Hey, my president is getting ready for a showdown. Showdown implies that there's some war that's going to happen, and that my leader is not afraid to partake in that. If we look quickly, just a couple of words that maybe bring a few emotions to the fore. Yeah, is the word offensive. Again, the opposite to that would be using defensive. They are not claiming that the Cubans have allowed the USSR into Cuba to put up missiles as a defensive measure. They are saying this is an offensive measure. So this is a war measure. This is something that's going to lead to a conflict. So looking down to the missile sites, Kennedy ready for Soviet showdown. So when we go back to the questions, first one there, it says 2.1. What message does the newspaper headline convey regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis? Here we again looking at one mark. If I get my pen working out, we're looking at one fact, for 2 marks. So this is a level 1 question. Again, this is just something that we can extract. So if we go through this quickly, what message does the newspaper headline convey regarding the Cuban Missile Crisis? If we go back to the headline, we would say basically showing that Kennedy is ready to take on the conflict. If I can highlight the answer in purple here, we talk about the Soviet showdown. Okay, based on the finding of offensive missile sites. So that is the information that we're getting from the headline. If we go back to question 2.2, it says, how did the New York Times portray President Kennedy? Keyword here is that of portray. When you portray someone, it's how they put across. How is Kennedy put across? Due to the information shown in the headline. If we go back to the source, we see the only mention of Kennedy is right at the end over here. I'll just move that down. It says, Kennedy ready for Soviet showdown. Again, it shows us a leader that is not willing to stand back. The fact that it talks about a showdown shows that Kennedy is willing to go into a fight. So it shows an inspirational leader willing to take the necessary actions. That is what we're going to put down as the answer to 2.2. And then the last question in this section, it says, explain how a devoted Soviet citizen would have responded to the newspaper headline. Here we're looking at 2 marks for 2 questions. Two facts required for 2 marks each will give us a total out of 4. So going back to the newspaper headline, let's just get rid of some of this other stuff that we've already looked at. Yeah, now if I was a Soviet citizen, these are the things that I would find difficult to bear. Firstly, I'd be upset that they referred to offensive missile sites. Offensive, again, means that the USR are the aggressors and that this is not a defensive measure. Secondly, that they referred to Kennedy ready for a Soviet showdown. I could argue the fact that this is in fact an example of propaganda against Russia and the USSR. So those are the 2 feelings that, if I was answering this question, those are the ones that I would put down. So that was the last question that we're going to look at, specifically the sources, the one-on-one question per source. The next two ones we're going to tackle are looking at the paragraph and the extended writing. And the first one we're going to be going through is question 3. If I can bring you down to the board, this is the paragraph question. Now we know for the source-based questions in all the papers that you're going to be answering, there will be 1 paragraph question. The things that we need to look at is that it's asking us to go through all the sources. It's asking us to write a paragraph of about 8 lines. They're giving us the market of 80 words. And the question that it's asking is, explain the impact that the Cuban Missile Crisis had on Khrushchev's political career. Now for a second, I want you just to forget about what is actually being asked, and let's focus on how we're going to be answering this question. We have got the information we need. We know we need to go back and look at all the sources. We know that we're looking to write between 8 to 10 lines, and they've given us a guideline of 80 words. The thing we need to remember that this is marked off a rubric. Now the rubric counts for 3 levels, going from, in this case, going from 0 to 2, then from 3 to 5, and then from 6 to 8 to finish off. And that is a rubric that will be used to mark this specific paragraph question. So going back to what it's specifically asking, it says here, explain the impact that the Cuban Missile Crisis had on Khrushchev's political career. So if we go back to the sources, okay, we look at the 2 extracts that were given at the top, extract 1, extract 2, and we look at the New York Times, the headline that was given. Those are the sources that we're dealing with. Now to answer this question specifically, we need to ask ourselves, was there only a negative impact on Khrushchev's political career? Or was there a positive one too? And the real answer when dealing with this is yes, that there was a positive and a negative. We just need to make sure that when we're writing, we're formatting this in the correct style, that it's written in a paragraph form. One tip I can give you is that if you put it into bulleted forms, where, for example, if I can show you on the screen, you put a bullet which denotes a point that you're going to make, and you talk about the positive, and then you put another bullet point, and you talk about the negative. A person who's marking that paper at the end of the year is not going to read it. Please, it needs to be set out in the correct format. And the correct format for a paragraph is that you have an establishing sentence. Your opening sentence is going to describe, and in this case we'll say, by looking at both the positive and negative influences that the sources that were given to us had on Khrushchev's career, we're going to be highlighting some of those with the eventual outcome where we give our point of view. Ultimately, it was negative. He was fired. He lost his job. or ultimately it was positive, and he is remembered by all of us as being one of the great statesmen of the Cold War because of his diplomatic stance that he took when dealing with Kennedy. If I can go down, I'm not going to go through all the points with you. You can get this information from all your textbooks, any notes that you've been given throughout the year, and what we've already discussed into today's lesson. This is the model answer. Again, please, just because I'm showing you the model answer does not mean that you're allowed to put it in bullet forms. But the establishing point, as your establishing sentence, will include what you're going to talk about. So let me highlight in your opening sentence in green. You're going to be talking about the positive and negative impact that the missile crisis had on Khrushchev's political career. Then your second sentence and probably third sentence, you'll talk about the positive, the good things that happened because of it. Your fourth and fifth sentence, you'll be talking about the negative. And then finally, your sentence after that, any other information that you've picked up from the sources, will go into that final sentence. Paragraph done. It's out of 8 marks. It will be marked off a rubric of 3 levels, depending on the information you've given. Will count for majority of those marks, but obviously that you've set it out in the right format, will count for the rest of the marks. They marry that up together, and the person marking your final paper at the end of the year will give you a mark out of 8. But please, again, no bullets. Make sure you set it out correctly, and you are writing 1 paragraph. Please, if you've started getting to a page length, you have gone too far, and you're only wasting your own time. If we can go on to question 4. It says here, answer one of the following questions, question 4.1 or question 4.2. Now, the options they always give you, the first essay option will be a straightforward. This is information that you need to know. It's going to ask you to take a stance or to take a point of view or to have an argument. The second essay question will always be looking at the sources to come up with an argument based on the sources that are provided. The important thing that we need to remember, and I stress this to my learners all the time, is that you need to plan. If you consider that essay is going to take you between half an hour and 45 minutes to write, at least half of that time needs to be spent on proper planning. If you plan correctly, you'll find that writing the essay will go quickly and smoothly. And we know that essay matrix that is, or extended writing, matrix that is used is a matrix out of 30, where half the marks is for presentation and the other half of the marks are for content. So if we get this right from the offset, there's no reason why we cannot achieve at least a mid to high 20s mark, just that we've set it out correctly and have got a majority of the facts together. If I can draw your attention to the board here, there are a few important things that we need to discuss very briefly, not so much on the content of these type of essays, but how we're going to be setting them up. Firstly, what I found that has worked in the past is that we take this topic. Again, it's asking, explain how the USSR and the USA contributed to Cold War tensions in Cuba. Now, from that, we need to do the following as far as our planning goes. I call them establishing points. You might call them point 1, point 2, point 3. These ultimately are the main focus points of the essay. What you'll be doing, or the extended writing, what you'll be doing with these points later on, they will become the first opening sentence of your paragraph, and then according to your planning, that information is what is going to be shifted underneath into that paragraph. So most paragraphs, or extended writings, we can find between 3 and possibly 6 at a maximum establishing points. If you've got less than 3, you haven't planned correctly. If you've got more than 5, 6, you've gone to too much detail and you need to cut back. So for this essay, establishing point number 1, okay, we'd basically look at the USSR's contribution to Cold War tensions. So that would be your establishing point number 1. Focusing on the USSR. Let's go for another color. Let's go for yellow. Establishing point number 2. Okay, we'd be focusing on the USA. Again, also contribution to Cold War tensions in Cuba. The third one that we could highlight is Cuba itself. Yeah, what ultimately brought these two superpowers' involvement in Cuba. And then establishing point 4, try to find a color that will stick out. Obviously, my planning is all in a circle here. You would have it set out in a much more formal way. But basically, that's establishing point 4 would be the outcomes, how the situation was averted, for example. So once we've identified our establishing points, we then go and put the information that each of those are going to carry. So for example, we were talking about the USSR contribution to Cold War tensions. That is the point in, let's just get back to our yellow pen. That's the one we're talking about, sorry, our green pen. It shows how neat I'm doing this. Focusing specifically on the USSR, there we would talk about the USSR's wanting to get a foothold close to the United States, wanting to re-establish what we discussed before, this idea of a balance in the world because of the mutually assured destruction, and wanting to have a trading partner or an economic stance in South America. So that would be initially why the USSR went into that region. America, we would be looking at the initial response to Castro taking over with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and then also what was their response when the USSR moved in? What was Kennedy's response? All those things we would be mentioning under establishing point 2. Establishing point 3, looking at Cuba, would be identify how we got to the situation in the first place, and if we were planning this correctly, obviously your establishing point 3 would be the initial one that we put in. So ultimately, once you've got your 4 establishing points, if I can go down a little bit, obviously this is a history lesson, not an art lesson, so no commentary on what we write in here. So firstly, our first paragraph when writing the extended writing is going to be the introduction. Again, we don't write introduction. We just put the name of the number of the question down. Our introduction will include all our establishing points. So we will be talking in our current example, we'll be looking at firstly the USSR's, how they contributed to tension, the United States contribution to tension, Cuba, how it contributed to getting these superpowers together in the first place, and then ultimately what was the outcome. All of those establishing points will now become grouped together in an introductory paragraph. So you write your paragraph. Within those paragraphs, you'll have your establishing point 1, 2, 3, and 4. Just mention these are the things that we're going to talk about. Your first paragraph, therefore, will be establishing point 1. I'm writing it in here so you can see it. Again, we're not allowed sentences, we're not allowed headings when writing extended writings. So please don't underline anything when you are doing your practical section here and you're actually writing your neat copy out. No headings allowed. Another tip, no bullets, no shortening of information. Extended writing refers to the paragraphs and the correct content and presentation. So establishing points, you'll write your 3 or 4 lines based on the information that you put under your planning. Then your establishing point 2, establishing point 3 will all become their own paragraphs as we did in establishing point 1. And ultimately we'll have establishing point 4 that we will write. And then finally after that, we've got our conclusion. Now our conclusion is to tie up our line of argument. So basically that we mentioned establishing point 1, the USSR's contribution to tensions in Cuba. The person that's going to be marking your final paper wants to see that it's been mentioned in your introduction. There's a line of argument that follows it where it's explained. And then ultimately it is mentioned again in the conclusion. And I hope that everyone understands that. The line of argument is that you spoke about what you were going to discuss in the extended writing. You then explained why you were discussing it with all the reasons that you put in your planning. And then you mention it to close it up again at the end of the essay. So, for example, in this case, you would say using establishing point 1 in your conclusion, having looked at the USSR's contribution to the tensions, we can see that ultimately they were responsible, however you want to end it up. Here's my last tip before we have to close off today, is that you're not writing a thriller novel where we have to wait till the last line to say who actually committed the murder. That is not the point of the extended writing. A lot of boys that I teach, they get to the end and then they think it's some big unveiling at the end of the extended writing when they finally give out the truth or the information that they're trying to be withhold. There's nothing that is mentioned in the conclusion that you have not yet mentioned in your paragraph and ultimately in your introduction. So on that note, I'd like to wish you all the best. I hope that you found this session informative, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime. Welcome to Learn Extra Matric Revision. Today we're going to be covering history question 1 of paper 1, looking at the Cold War and the influence that had in forming specific spheres of influence in the world during the 1960s and onwards. You'll notice that today is the first time that we are broadcasting the history program, hence the need for me to wear a suit and tie to dedicate this specific occasion. So please excuse my formalness. And as we move on, hopefully you can spend some time relaxing with me and getting through question 1 of the history paper. So if we can go and move on to the session. If you see down on the board, I have here the impact of the Cold War. And there are a few things on a checklist that are important for us to know. Firstly, the whole theme surrounds the idea of this creation of spheres of influence. Now, the influence comes from an ideological background of that versus capitalism versus communism. And the whole theme that we look at as we go in through this question 1 basically surrounds those two ideologies. So everything that we look at will go back to that specific theme. Underneath that, we have this whole breakup of the economic, the political, and the social conditions that happened because of this split in the world at the time. And the first one that we need to know and we need to look at is this whole idea of the two armed wings of the specific groups. The first one being NATO. If you see on the board, was the only or last vestige of capitalist control in Southeast Asia, and they wanted to hang on to their position. The USSR sponsored the Viet Cong to try to expel the Americans. Eventually, we know that was a long, drawn-out affair. But again, ultimately, what it came down to was this whole idea of mutually assured destruction, which meant that the two superpowers never took that to a live conflict between themselves. For the past year and for the future years, as far as we can tell at the moment, the specific section that we're going to be looking at when looking at these regional conflicts as a case study for question 1 will revolve around Cuba. Now, Cuba is probably one of the more important ones, not in terms of length, but in terms of when two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, came the closest to actually coming to a physical war situation. We will go through each of these points, and you'll notice when later on seeing some of the questions from the last year's paper, we'll be looking at some of the extracts where that whole idea will come through, how this actually almost turned into a hot war. And to understand Cuba, we need to understand its history, and that goes back to the Civil War, where Castro seizes power. Castro was a socialist. He came and took control over Cuba when General Batista, he was in charge of Cuba leading up 1940s, early 1950s. He was a pro-capitalist. He was supported by the Americans, and he had close economic ties with America. Castro was a people's leader, people's liberator. He had large support from the peasants and the farmers that lived in Cuba at the time. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and was basically the USA's, the United States of America, should I say. It was their armed grouping that was there to protect the ideas and ideals of capitalism against those of communism. Secondly, we have the Warsaw Pact, which was the USSR's response to NATO. That took into account a lot of the countries that were placed in the European satellite states, we call them, in Eastern Europe, who came under the influence of Russia, and together, obviously, we had the USSR. Then we have the Marshall Plan, which is another key point that we need to understand, not so much in what will be asked in this year's paper, but more of an understanding when it comes to writing and extended writing, that we have an idea of where these ideas come from. So the Marshall Plan is one that we look at. You'll know that General Marshall was involved in Europe on the United States side at the end of World War II. It was the economic recovery plan that was instituted by the Americans for the Europeans to help them overcome the savages and the economic downfall after World War II. The Marshall Plan was obviously also given as a way to prevent communism, from coming into those countries that were devastated by the war. Comecon was a similar initiative implemented by the USSR, basically, which was an economic policy that involved itself and its allies, which we've already mentioned, with the satellite states that existed in Eastern Europe. It tied them together in a long-term sort of plan. The third one, and probably one of the more important key points that we need to understand as we move through the United States and of the USSR, they basically balanced each other out. If there was one country that was dominant, there would have been, or one superpower which was dominant, it would have overpowered the other one, and there would have been a conflict that took place. But because they were on level footing with each other, that never ever turned into a heated war. So it remained a Cold War, hence the term that was used all the way up until the end of the 1980s. But please remember this idea of mutually assured destruction. It's governed a lot of policies of both the USSR premiers and the presidents of the United States. As I mentioned before, these two superpowers, although they never came into contact with each other, they were involved with regional conflicts in all over the world, from Asia to Africa to the Pacific, and further on into South America. The first one that we've looked at, and you would have covered this when going through the curriculum in your own schools, would be the initial one in Korea, which happened in the late 1940s, early 50s. Then we went into Vietnam, and then finally the USSR invasion in Afghanistan. Now, because those were regional conflicts that happened, the superpowers were not necessarily fighting each other, but they were supporting different groups within those regional conflicts. So, for example, in Vietnam, where we had the Viet Cong, which was a communist group, they were supported by the USSR. They were provided with training. They were provided with military weapons. America went in there to stop the Viet Cong from taking control in Vietnam because of their containment policy. They felt that Vietnam, this Cold War puzzle, is that of containment versus expansion. Now, the containment comes in the idea that after World War II, with the advancement of communism and it really becoming sort of an ideal that could replace capitalism for many countries and the conditions that they were in, the Americans, under President Truman at the time, decided to put this idea of containing communism as opposed to allowing it to expand. Where obviously the USSR at the same time was trying to expand its influence around the world, so that would have meant introducing communism into more countries and obviously expanding their sphere of influence. The United States tried to garner that by their policy of containment, and that is covered under the Truman Doctrine, which provided not only financial but also military and economic support to countries that signed in with the idea of staying a capitalist country and formed part of the countries that would eventually form up the membership of NATO. Now, the whole thing that tied this together, if we can carry on here, this balance of power is an extremely important concept. And the reason that it's an important concept is that we know the Cold War never became a heated war, if we can use that term, between the United States and the USSR, between communism and capitalism. There was no physical battle that ever took place between those two superpowers. And the reason for that was this whole idea of mutually assured destruction. We know it as MAD. It will often come up in a question paper. It will have the acronym. MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction, which basically, because of the size of the military arsenals of both